Hello and welcome to this module of your online grant training. In this module, we'll be covering compelling program design elements. When we think about our compelling program design elements, these are the program design details that we're writing about in our application. And as you can see, if this is the first of our modules that you're joining us for, I'm a Grant Professional certified through the Grant Professional Certification Institute and an approved trainer of the Grant Professionals Association. Neither of those bullets, nor do any of the other details in my bio, say that I have implemented, I have managed the programs of nonprofits, that I've done the direct service work that is often being requested. So what does that mean? Well, I started as a grant maker. I've been a grant seeker now for more than 15 years. And when we talk about program design elements, it means I'm going to need a lot of input from the colleagues that I'm working with in the nonprofit organization that have the expertise in the methodologies, in the ideas behind what is it that we're going to do as an organization and why. So the three program design elements that we're going to cover in this module, they are the way in which we document the program design with the input usually of our colleagues. Now sometimes, and maybe for some of you, you wear both the grant professional hat and the program director, the subject matter expert about the work that's going to be done, about the programs or the services that are going to be offered. Regardless, grant writer or grant writer that also is a program design expert, we're going to focus on three specific program design elements today in this module that will help make our application compelling and competitive. So we'll begin with logic models. Now, logic models, you love them or maybe not so much. When we think about logic models, they are a way at a quick glance in one 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper for a grant maker or a grant reviewer to understand at a rather high level, what is it you are going to do? That is what they'll walk away from reading a logic model with, an understanding of what is it you're going to do and what is some of the impact that you might create. When we look at logic models, there are two types of logic models. There's the theory of change model. So this is the way that an organization will present what is it that you think you can bring about for change? What is the impact that you think you'll create? This is a very high level overview of what the change is that you think you can create. The second type of logic model is a program logic model. So if theory of change is up here, high level, a program logic model is coming down a little bit lower. We're not at actual implementation ground level in terms of the details, but this is an outline, a visual representation of the resources we need, of the activities that we plan to conduct, of the outputs, the things that will count, and the outcomes that we anticipate achieving over a period of time. So those are the two types of logic models that we'll look at, usually a theory of change and a program logic model. When grant makers are looking at logic models, when they're looking at your materials, or maybe if it's that you're looking at a template that a grant maker has provided, how would you know which type of logic model it is that you're reading? Well, if we see that a template, something that's being called a logic model, if it has zero time frame included, there's no time-bound element at all, what are we reading? We'd likely be reading a theory of change logic model. Whereas if there was a time-bound element, it would be a program logic model is what we would be reading. If we see that the logic model we're reviewing has a very small number of elements in it. In fact, if we see language like if we do this, we get that, we are likely reading a theory of change logic model. Whereas if there are many elements, I'm going to show you some of the basic headings, but if there's the specific core elements with lots of details and information under it, we're reading a program logic model. A theory of change is usually more generic in the type of information and the level of detail that's being provided, whereas a program logic model is getting into very specific anticipated outcomes and results, maybe short-term, intermediate, and long-term. So those are some of the key differentials between a theory of change logic model and a program logic model. Now, if logic models are new to you, something that might help you think about what do they look like, how do I read them, given the wide range of templates that grant makers will utilize, it might be helpful for you to think about logic models using a conveyor belt, because the templates provided by grant makers sometimes read left to right or right to left, sometimes bottom to top or top to bottom. The idea, though, is that there is a flow of information within the logic model. Whether there's arrows in the document or not, we start with the inputs that we place on our conveyor belt, and by the time our program ends, by the time we reach the end of our conveyor belt, we've been able to talk about the outcomes that happened as a result of the project or program. So here are some key definitions that you might want to keep on hand. If we think about inputs, we'll see those in our visuals here in just a moment. These are the resources, supplies, equipment, people, collaborative partners. These are critical resources that we need to have in order to conduct a single activity. Activities are the type of things that are happening in order to achieve the mission or the vision of the project or the program. It's what's happening with the inputs. Outputs are direct products. They're things we can count. Outcomes, short-term, intermediate, or long-term, are benefits, changes, benefits, results, impacts that are being created during or after participating in a project or program. And then an indicator, which is sometimes visually shown within a logic model. This is what we might be measuring so that we can track the success. So those are our key definitions that you may want to refer back to the next time that you open up a grant application and you have a grant maker's logic model template. These are your basic definitions. So what are the steps that we conduct? What are the pieces of information we're gathering? That first bit of information that we place on our conveyor belt, that first step is our resource section. Sometimes called inputs. They mean the same thing regardless of the funder's choice. These are the things that we will need in order to conduct the activities. From the resources, we're able to move into that next section. We're able to move into activities. I often say this is where the magic happens. It's where the hot meals are delivered, where the caregiver education is provided, where the health outreach is done within the community. You name it, this is where you do it. This is the biggest portion of the logic model in terms of how much information you could place. You've got a ton of details about your methodologies and who will do what, when, and where, and how. This isn't the place. The logic model is an overview. It's usually, like I said, an 8.5 by 11 page representation of the overall program design. You're going to have the chance to flush out your activities in much more detail when it comes time to the work plan. So don't fall victim to the pressure to put all the details in this section. This is only your initial level of detail about the activities. You'll have the opportunity to flush this section out further to provide a great deal more detail in just a few program design elements later. As we move along in our logic model, thinking about that progression, again, maybe with a conveyor belt and our analogy there, as we move from resources and inputs through our activities, the direct product, the output of the activities, This is what's produced or created because of the work that we're doing. So these are the numbers that we're counting, the number of hot meals we provided, the number of caregiver education sessions that we offered, the number of outreach classes that we held. What can we count? Who did we serve? How many of those individuals did we serve? In many cases, your outputs, they're going to be quantifiable. And so this is one of the initial places that if you're reporting to a grant maker, this is an initial spot that you would focus on your reporting. Now, it's not only enough to report on outputs. Grant makers want to know, what is the impact that our funding helped to create? That takes us into the next section of our logic model. We'd be thinking about short-term outcomes. So what are the anticipated changes? The changes in awareness, knowledge, skill, or behavior that happen as a result of our work. We wouldn't be able to talk about these potential outcomes if we hadn't already conducted the activities. We need those awesome activities we've outlined just a moment ago in the logic model. We need for those to happen in order for there to be any outcomes to report. Short-term outcomes are usually the items that can be measured and reported on right as the activity is ending or right after the activity has ended. What happens though if the clock keeps running? We get those short-term outcomes measured and reported. What happens if we're maybe 3 to 6 or even 7 months past the activity itself? Well, now we're into intermediate outcomes. So here we are presenting our theory, our best laid plan, our best idea. What are the anticipated changes? Again, awareness, knowledge, skill, and behavior. What are those anticipated changes that we would expect to see a few months after the activity has happened? This takes time and effort and money in order to be able to track. We may have conducted activities where we don't have access to the individuals, the community, or the group that we worked with that far down the line. But we might still have a theory about what would be that intermediate anticipated outcome. Here, we're not talking about the budget and the activities related to measure and track these outcomes. Rather, we're talking about, by doing this work, what do we expect the anticipated outcomes to be? We'll deal with the money part and how to do it later. Here you are sharing the theory. By having your target audience, your community participate in these activities, this is what we expect for our intermediate outcomes. Well, intermediate outcomes take us a few months past the activity. After that, if we were still thinking about our conveyor belt, where would that take us? That would take us to long-term outcomes. Long-term outcomes, you guessed it, thinking about anticipated changes in awareness, knowledge, skill, and or behavior. So our outcomes are looking at the same 4 potential changes, but they're looking at them over different periods of time. When we think about a long-term outcome, this is much farther down the horizon. Here we're probably talking about something that is a year or more past the activity that was included in your logic model. Now, if we talk about dependency on resources, tracking, keeping in touch with, having access to your participants, those that you serve, a year or more after they have participated in an activity, just might not be possible. Again, in the logic model, what we're focused on are what are the theoretical anticipated outcomes as a result of those initial activities. We're not yet talking about promising or committing to having the resources, the time, and the people power to get all that measured and reported. But what we're doing is saying, as a result of this activity, this is what we anticipate would be a long-term outcome as a result. So I hope that that's clear, that as we're laying out the logic model, And the short-term, intermediate, and long-term outcomes, we're talking about what is anticipated. We are not yet committing to spending the budget or conducting those key activities to measure and gather the indicators related to these outcomes. We're not there yet. Now here's a visual representation of what this might look like. You might walk along the arrows. You can see that there's actually some more information in this visualization than we've talked about. There was some basic information the funder wanted in this format with a problem statement and an underlying assumption, so that it was also part of the quick visual reference before you started to explain about the resources, the activities, the outputs, and the outcomes. Now in this example, you can see that short-term and long-term are the only two outcome columns in the logic model. Within the grantmaker's template, they did not have room for intermediate outcomes. So you might want to ask the grantmaker, how are they defining short-term versus long-term? That way you have clarity about where in your timeline would you break what you include in short-term versus long-term. Here's one more example to help give you some ideas of what a logic model might look like. Now, unlike the black and white version we saw on the last slide, this one's got all sorts of color to it. But in some ways, we want to think about that as those are bells and whistles. Don't let the color distract you. We can see that this particular grant maker, again, provided some initial context to the logic model template, the situation and priorities to consider. But then we still find inputs or resources, activities. They're calling that an output in this model, but that's okay. We know that they mean, what do we do? Participation, they're saying, who are we reaching? Who will we count? How many people? How many agencies? And then with outcomes, in this instance, we see short-term, medium-term, oh, that makes sense, intermediate, okay, and long-term. So here we don't have to worry so much about how would we consolidate that intermediate section into short and long, like the last example, but we might have some questions about that participation column over what would normally be only outputs. But here they're calling outputs activities and participation in their heading. Our same basic framework is there though. And by having your key definition slide available, regardless of the format that a grantmaker presents you with, you'll be able to take your basic information from the organization and complete the grantmaker's template. When we think about logic models, I hope that walking through those key definitions and a few examples of what they might look like helps you to feel more comfortable with what it is that you're documenting within a logic model so that you can move on to the next program design elements. We still have to talk about SMART objectives and also about work plans. But before you do that, before you go to the next sections of this module, if you have a question, please be sure to reach out. My email is diane@dhleonardconsulting.com. I can't wait to see you in our next section of this module. We'll be talking about SMART objectives.